Now, this is my Sony FX6, and we've pretty much had a relationship for the last couple of years. I've used it on anything from gimbal movements to documentaries, commercials, even on this YouTube channel as well. And sometimes you get bored, and sometimes you need something new. Sometimes you might step outside of the relationship with your camera, and you might try something a little bit different. And you probably know where I'm going with this, because today's video, we're actually going to compare the Sony FX6 to the Ronin 4D. We'll get there. Now, it's been a while since I've been excited about comparing the bodies of two cameras because usually all of them are kind of the same. But like, the Sony FX6 has the usual suspects. It has the audio top handle, which I'm still not the biggest fan of in the configuration. It has a monitor that's on there that's small, it's compact, although it's not the best quality screen in the world, but you always use other monitors. And you also have the side handle grip that you can control things like your clear image zoom and a couple of custom functions as well. Also, on the camera itself, you're gonna have all your control buttons. You're gonna have a panel for your built-in NDs and all the other stuff that's going to be there. We've gone through this already. But when I talk about the Ronin 4D, there's a ton of different moving parts going with this guy that it's really hard to cover in just one video. You're gonna have two of the handles that can actually detach from the Ronin 4D itself, and each handle has a bunch of different controls like your zoom function, your focus on the LiDAR, which you're gonna talk about a little bit later, your recording, and a bunch of other custom buttons and features that you can program onto either side handle. On top of that, you're also going to get a bigger and arguably nicer monitor on the Ronin 4D. It's a much larger screen, it's nice and bright, it's touchscreen as well, and you have a bunch of controls and functionality as well, and you could do things like your waveform and your focus breathing. Anything you really need to get on an external monitor, you can get on the Ronin 4D and the one that comes with it. Now, the only thing I'm not the biggest fan of in terms of the Ronin 4D is the fact that it actually does have proprietary memory. Now, I'm not a big fan of proprietary memory. I love being able to use either third-party resources whenever I can, as long as they're reputable, but you do have the ability to actually connect this directly through USB-C, so if you want to record in ProRes RAW, which we'll talk about later, well, this is the guy you need to use, and you don't need a reader for it. Now, we will compare autofocus later on in this video, but the Ronin 4D has the ability to have something called LiDAR attached to it. Now, if you're somebody who has the RS3 Pro with the LiDAR, it's actually a rangefinder that helps you control your focus. So you could actually turn a lot of the lenses with a follow focus into a lens that has autofocus. On top of that, if you want to use cine lenses, you could actually put a focus motor on here as well, and now your cinema lenses also have autofocus on it. And speaking of the actual lens mount itself and everything around the kind of top part here, you also get an interchangeable mount. Now, I have used some of my Sony E-mount lenses on the Ronin 4D and got a couple of shots, but it's really cool that not only can you use a DL mount that's going to be native to here, which I was using the 17-28 for a lot of footage, but if you do have other mounts on a camera, particularly the E-mount, you can always switch them up and you don't have to buy new lenses. Oh, right, it does this. Now, you might call this a chicken head, but if you have Urban Dictionary, you know that that's not the same thing. I'm born in the 90s, don't call it that. Anyways, let's talk about some footage. Image quality and the color right off the bat between these two, they're both great, but they are a little bit different. Now, natively inside of the camera, we actually can use ProRes RAW on the Ronin 4D, and we can use 10-bit S-Log on the Sony FX6. When we compare the actual internal codecs that you can get out of each camera, both produce really nice images. However, I do find ProRes RAW to be a little bit more accurate, which we'll see in a little bit of the tests going on later on. However, I do find that the image on the FX6 is a little bit more pleasing. It has a little bit less sharpened of a look. Now, that might be a factor of the lens that I was using because it was a 17-28 versus the 24mm to keep things equal. However, I did find on the Sony FX6, albeit not necessarily having the most color depth as ProRes RAW, it actually still looked pretty good and I liked it a bit more. Now, comparing 6K to 4K, the writing's on the wall there. The 6K is obviously going to be the clear winner here. Both are using full frame sensors, and you're gonna get a little bit more out of cropping and reframing and stabilizing on 6K footage versus the internal 4K that's on the FX6. Now, for those of you guys that know about this channel, when we talk about dynamic dynamic range. I just like using it in a functional aspect. My general setup is going to be exposing for my windows to get some detail out and then bringing in a small light to actually light up my subject. And if both cameras can do that and the window isn't blown out, that's more than enough for me. And it actually does pretty well on either one of these two cameras. Now, I did do a little bit of research to find some of the charts, and the Ronin 4D actually technically has a little bit more dynamic range than the Sony FX6. Now, this might not be the perfect example because I'm not exactly good at doing these lab tests. However, I did find you get a little bit more dynamic range on the Ronin 4D than the Sony FX6, but that also might be a function because one was shot at f2.8 and the other one was shot at f2, and there's a little bit more blur in the background, and that's nor here nor there. Either way, you got information out of the highlights, which is great on both cameras. Now, in terms of low light, both cameras are going to have a dual base ISO. Now, the FX6 has 800 and 12,800, which you've seen a bunch of times, and it looks really good and amazingly clean. However, the Ronin 4D has 800 and 5,000, which is actually really good as well. Now, the Ronin 4D versus the Sony FX6 both perform really well at 800 ISO. Now, where the ProRes RAW on the Ronin 4D feels a little bit more color accurate, it feels a little bit more like there's more depth in terms of the color, I do find that you aren't going to have a good highlight roll-off, at least not as much as the Sony FX6. However, I do like the color on the Ronin 4D a little bit more, which is great because that ProRes RAW has a little bit more color depth. Now, when we bump up into our high base ISO in the 5,000 versus the 12,800, even though you're going to get pretty decent performance, the Ronin 4D does have a lot of chroma noise that's in it. Now, the 12,800 on the Sony side of things isn't perfect either. It's still clean, but it still does have noise in it as well. However, you are going to notice that that color noise is a little bit more off-putting, at least to my eyes, versus the Sony FX6. So in terms of low light, it's not quite the level of Sony. However, it does do a pretty decent job, and I'm sure you could just use a denoiser to clean that up. In fact, that's exactly what I did. Now, we probably should have mentioned this first or a little bit earlier in the video, but the autofocus systems are going to be different in each one. Now, the Sony FX6 has built-in face tracking with an eye autofocus as well. The Ronin 4D only has the LiDAR connection in terms of its autofocus. Now, the LiDAR actually works pretty well, especially for a camera up this caliber with a gimbal attached to it. However, sometimes it tends to hunt, especially if you're in a darker situation, which means that in the autofocus department, the Sony FX6 is going to win. The Ronin 4D is very decent, it's good, and it's usable. However, with that eye autofocus tracking and the years of experience I had in autofocus, the Sony's a no-brainer here. It's going to win. Now, the specs and the color science and all that stuff is fine and good. However, if you can't use them in your own practical application, then it all doesn't mean anything at all. Now, I did shoot a couple of projects on the Ronin 4D, and I've had the Sony FX6 for like 2.5 years. Now, the Sony FX6 could actually break down into a very small package, so you can use it to be a little bit more inconspicuous. Now, the Ronin 4D has a ton of functionality like wireless control using the handles, a gimbal that's attached to it, 6K, interchangeable mounts. It has all those things, but it's also not the smallest thing in the world, and it's not the easiest to be a little bit more inconspicuous with it. If I'm holding this around in a place that I probably shouldn't, or I might get asked questions, it's a lot harder for me to hide this than something that's small like the Sony FX6. Now, the solo operator job that I did do is I was actually working on a spec commercial with my friend Victor Laforteza, and fashion's not something that I'm used to, but I did know I wanted a lot of gimbal usage for it, and that's where the Ronin 4D was going to win. It has everything built in already, you don't have to worry about balancing, and if you are in a small crew, you can use the external monitor in order for you to pull focus for you or to show that as a client monitor. Now, going back into the Ronin 4D's autofocus and that it's not the most perfect thing in the world, they actually mitigate that by giving the opportunity to connect to a wireless monitor and just using one of the handles as a focus puller. So essentially what I did was I took off one of the handles, stuck it onto a monitor, handed it to somebody that was on set with me, and they were pulling focus for me to make up for that autofocusing issue. Now, the Sony FX6 wouldn't have that problem. However, you'd have to buy a gimbal and a gimbal ring or handles and buy a bunch of other accessories just to get your FX6 to be gimbal operational. However, the Sony FX6, and we've all talked about this before, most gimbals don't work with the top handle attached, and if you use that on the Sony FX6, well, you're not going to have any audio. Now, the Ronin 4D does have a 3.5mm jack, which is the bare minimum that I would expect on a cinema camera. However, if I wanted to use this as an A camera, I kind of wish that there was XLR. Now, at the time of this video, there actually is an XLR module that you could attach onto the Ronin 4D, but that's just more money that you're going to have to spend. And if we're comparing dollars to donuts, the Sony FX6 might be a better option if you need to use that XLR audio, albeit you don't have a gimbal. Now, if you are someone that works with a small crew or a small team, both these cameras perform pretty well. Now, the Sony FX6 has the ability to not only be good for tripod, documentary work, and more corporate stuff because it has the audio inputs, it has SDI in it, it has all the things that you're looking for. The Ronin 4D I find is more of a really high quality B camera or a gimbal camera. Now, it might be a little bit surprising, but the Ronin 4D, for being a camera that does have a gimbal attached to it, also works really well as a tripod camera. You could mount a plate on the bottom of this and you could use it on a Manfrotto tripod or anything like that, and you can use it for those type of situations if they arise if you don't have another camera. On top of that, the Ronin 4D and DJI as a whole has a lot of different ways that you can connect your camera to different monitors and have focus pullers and have different people with different responsibilities on set in order to make this the perfect camera if you're working with a small team that's going to not only operate the camera, but you might have someone that's a focus puller or someone that's controlling the gimbal itself. That being said, in a world where if I had neither of these cameras, which one would I pick? And I think if you're somebody that's going to be more on the solo shooter side of things, someone that needs to shoot a lot more handheld, and someone that doesn't use a gimbal all that often, Sony FX6 does make a ton of sense in terms of those cinema camera features that you need and being able to dress the camera up or dress the camera down. However, if you're somebody that is ready to use 6K ProRes RAW, have a camera with a gimbal attached to it, you shoot a lot of gimbal stuff, and you have a small team that can operate the camera to make some really cool and interesting stuff, the Ronin 4D it's amazing. It's a lot of fun, and it's probably the most fun you're going to have operating on a camera. This thing works really well in terms of building out a camera kit for a multitude of different productions. In fact, I wish I had enough money where I could actually keep both of these. However, I only gotta pick one. But I'm not going to, because I have to send the Ronin 4D back to DJI in like an hour. That being said, I hope you guys learned something, or at the very least you enjoyed this video, or that flipped around. But if you guys want to see another video, I'll leave it somewhere on the screen because we have some important things to talk about, especially my Sony FX6. All right, well, peace.